We're talking now with Joe Medlin, who has had a long career in teaching adult basic education, adult literacy in a whole range of contexts, and who was the teacher and educational consultant on the SBS program Lost for Words. As well as that, Jo is the president of the Australian Council for Adult Literacy, so she's a very good person to talk to about these things. And I thought we might talk a little, Jo, about just who these adults are who come to us for help with their literacy. What are their stories and what are some of the reasons that they find themselves as adults and have to improve their reading and writing? So we might start with that question. What are some of the reasons that, what are some of the stories that your students have told you about their lives?
Okay, well, I think everyone has a different motivation for coming to adult literacy. But usually what's happened is that people have been going along quite well, probably in a great job that they like, you know, raising their family, everything else, and then suddenly something happens where they think, oh, actually, maybe I do need to do something now and change what I'm doing, get some assistance. There's some sort of barrier or challenge that they come up against, and it brings them to us. And it's at that point, I think, where you really need to think about what it's been like for that person to come to your literacy class or to your tutoring experience with the fear probably that they're experiencing in telling a stranger that they need some assistance with their reading and writing.
And what are the reasons why they didn't actually meet the milestones at school that people think, you know, we've had compulsory education in Australia, so how can somebody leave school and still have struggled with the reading and writing? What are some of the stories about what's gone wrong with their childhood or adolescence?
Well, I think this is another really interesting thing that I've learnt myself over the years, is that everyone has a different story and they've all had different experiences, but at some point something didn't work for them in the way that perhaps we think that it should have. And I think that we need to be really careful about talking to people about what happened in the past. It's really important to acknowledge that it's nobody's fault. We don't blame somebody for becoming an adult and needing some help with their literacy or their numeracy. What we need to do, I think, is give people the opportunity to talk to us about what they think happened and what they experienced and what it's like from their point of view. But as a literacy teacher, I always think to myself, I know thinking about my own past, my experience is not reflected in what my family members might say about something that we all experience together. So you can only put so much store into what people tell you about what happened in the past. So I guess the most important point, Pam, that I want to make is that we're not here to go back into the past to find someone to blame. This is just about giving people the opportunity to talk to us and then helping them to move on. And so we've got to think future all the time, but with an acknowledgement that something's happened in the past that obviously was maybe a bit painful. And the sorts of stories that I've heard from people usually revolve around some sort of trauma that happened when they were a child. And it might be that they were being bullied, or they missed a lot of school because they were unwell, or perhaps they were at a huge school and they kind of got lost in the mix and they were really quiet and flew under the radar, or perhaps their coping strategy was to act out. And so nobody realised that actually they needed more assistance than they were getting. So there's all sorts of reasons.
That's right. They often come along as, with the feeling that because I didn't succeed, I must be a bit stupid. And then you start to chat and you find that they missed a whole lot of schooling because of an illness or family breakup, or they were in foster care or something. And unless you're feeling comfortable and relaxed and receptive at school, then you can sit there but not be able to take it in. You're not ready to take it in. And the bullying, I think, is probably a big one. People tell us stories about their school days and you realise you were bullied. And that's why you were not feeling relaxed and able to take it in.
Well, I think another really important thing to understand is that there was no fantastic golden era of education in the past.
There wasn't.
There was no time when everyone came out of school reading and writing. In fact, what happened was that people just left. I've had students who left when they were in 5th grade, 6th grade, year 7, and went off to work, say, in a manual job somewhere on the family farm, or they just fell out of the education system altogether. So I think that's another really important thing to think about, that we're not saying that in the past school was better and there's something that's not working now. These are societal issues, and what we really need to focus on with the people who come to us is to say, it's so great that you're here, and let's think about what we can do for the future.
Yes, there's a lot of sort of misconceptions in the general public about what the problem was. And one of them often is that educational standards are in decline, and if only schools and teachers would do their job properly, then we wouldn't need adult literacy classes anymore. So how do you respond to that, Jo? What's your response to that one?
Well, I think that's a huge myth. I think that teachers work really hard, and I think that there's the best opportunity that we can give to children is being given. And every teacher that I know works so hard, so many hours, and are so passionate about what they do, but other things will always happen. And the other thing that we really need to think about nowadays is that literacy demands are changing. So what you had to do 10 years ago is so totally different to the types of reading and writing that you might need to do today. And we can think about all those things like online shopping, checking in, using QR codes, even things like emails. So there's not many jobs now where you wouldn't need some sort of reading and writing skill, whereas in the past you had so many jobs where that was someone else's responsibility, a manager or a supervisor. So I think that workplaces and life in general have changed. We all need help at some stage, even as I consider myself to be highly literate, but every time I work for a new organisation, I have to relearn the systems. I have to understand what they expect when they want me to do a report. My literacy needs are changing all the time. So if you are somebody who was already struggling, or you're a little bit worried or nervous about having to show other people you're reading and writing, I can only imagine that those demands are becoming quite overwhelming.
Yeah, I used to work in the country for a long time, and very often students would come along and say, well, you know, I left school at 13 or 14 or something. Dad couldn't read and write, you know, we're on the land, we didn't need to do that. And then, of course, even on the land now, there's chemicals to be mixed up, and quickly they realise that they do need. The world has changed, so it's not the number of people with less skills that have changed, but it's the demands on us, on our daily lives. Jo, people like you and I talk about adults who struggle with reading and writing and other long-winded ways of referring to our students. Why don't we just say illiterate?
Well, I actually think that word doesn't belong in Australia, because everybody's reading, or anywhere, everybody's reading and writing something to some level. And whether that's using a strategy, you know, somebody might use a strategy that I don't use to get through life, that doesn't mean that they're not reading the world around them. So if we think of multi-literacies, and we think about reading signs, and we think about listening, and we think about engaging in other ways, then everybody has literacy. It's just some people want to improve their literacy, and some people are experiencing barriers. And the other thing I think that's really interesting here is that students that I've had have always talked about how they feel about this issue, and that other people judge them. And so that's why, you know, I like to say things like facing literacy barriers. That's not the person, that's something else, the task itself that we're putting the issue onto. And so that sort of language, I think, just helps establish that environment to say, I understand this isn't about you, this is about this task, and that's what we're going to look at, what we can do about it.
And for so long, it took on a very negative, you know, you're illiterate, you're a bit stupid, synonymous with stupid, so it really has no place in our lexicon at all, does it?
Pam, one of the other things that I might jump in there and say is that a number of students that I've worked with, when we've started to use the words as the educators to say literacy gaps, they have taken that on themselves.
Yeah.
And so it's more palatable for people to be able to talk to other people and say, I've been working on my literacy gaps. I'm not learning to read and write. I can already read and write.
Yeah.
I'm improving.
Yeah.
And so sometimes these words as well really help the adults who we're teaching or tutoring to also be able to talk about this and go out and encourage other people to get involved.
And as you were saying before, we all find ourselves in situations where we're challenged and have literacy gaps. By saying some of us are literate and some of us are illiterate, it suggests that there's a binary, and there's not a binary. We move between the two. Jo, sometimes our students leave us in awe of the things that they can actually manage to do in their world, even given the gaps that they have and the workarounds that they manage. Can you give us some examples of that?
I can. I think these days we're really fortunate to have voice to text, text to voice, all the spell checking mechanisms which I so heavily rely on myself. And I think an important thing as a tutor to realise is that none of these are cheating. I even am moving away from calling them workaround strategies. I think we just have to talk to them as strategies, and they're all valid and they're all fantastic. And so if there's any strategy that you use to calculate your shopping, to read the labels, to deal with your bills, to send your emails, then those are all valid strategies. And we shouldn't think of them as cheating. We're not at school, we're not having an exam, we're adults going about life. And so using a device, using a calculator. Asking someone, getting someone else to help us with something, all of these things are great strategies that people use. And there's, in improving literacy, we're not saying to people, give these up. We're just saying, here's another tool in your toolbox to use. Here's another way to do something.
Yeah, that we all do. Spelling is one that a student often feels the rest of us can spell properly and they can't. And yet in any office, like an office that we share, there's people yelling out all the time, how do you spell so-and-so? And we're literacy teachers. So, yeah, we need to pass on to our students that that's okay to say, hey, how do you spell something?
And I think there's also that sense that the rest of the world are somehow going about reading everything perfectly, writing everything right the first time, but we're not. We're doing the exact same steps.
And that sometimes it's not the fault of us who are having a struggle with it, but that it's the fault of the person who wrote the thing that's not reader friendly, that everything is not written to be easily read, because some people don't know how to do that.
That's such a great point, Pam, because the complexity of so many things that could be simplified, that could be made reader friendly, is really quite astounding when you have a look around you at the forms that you have to fill in, or how complex it is to do things, or even the vocabulary that people are writing down for really things that could be said in a much plainer way. It does create a barrier, and part of, I think, our role as teachers, and that people could do as tutors, is to bring that to the attention of the people who are producing that text and say, why is this so complex? Why is this not made easier for all of us to use? We're all time poor anyway, so even if it's not about how difficult it is to read, just make things easier and quicker for us all.
Exactly, exactly. Jo, from your long and varied teaching career, what are a few pieces of advice that you might give to a tutor or a teacher who's new to this field?
I think one of the main things that I think about when I think about myself as a teacher and how I interact with students is that I would very much encourage people to understand the role of a facilitator versus a teacher. So even though I am qualified as a teacher, I don't think of myself as a teacher in this circumstance. When I'm working in literacy and numeracy, I do think of myself as a facilitator. And it's part of that adult education principles, I guess, that come behind that. So I do think of myself as walking alongside with somebody, not leading them. So I'm not like perhaps a primary school teacher might be, standing at the front of the room imparting my knowledge to someone. It's very much about a two-way learning situation. And I think if you go into tutoring with that sort of attitude, then already you're probably a step ahead, because nobody wants to feel like, you know, they're a bit silly or somebody's looking down on them. And if you have that attitude that the person I'm working with here knows a lot of things and I'll probably learn something from them as well, then that will happen. And I always learn things from the people that I'm working with.
Yes. It's wonderful advice. Thank you, Jo.